Hi there, this is your Unit 3 video. Now, after the Unit 2 paper, there are a few things to take away. First of all, the comparison question was particularly difficult on Unit 2. It gave two texts that were very difficult to relate, whether through similarities or difference, so I fully expect that one to be taken into account with the WJEC, because I really don't feel like they were fair comparison articles. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. I think every school struggled on that one. What I would keep in mind for Unit 3, though, is the things that we know. First of all, advanced information has told us that we will have a talk and an article in this paper, so you know both of the writing pieces for this one, which is a massive advantage. Okay, that's 40 marks that they're giving you in order to revise. So the talk and the article that you produce better be good. We can sort of roughly guess what other questions may come up based on Unit 2. So we know a comparison and a how question came up, and they were both 10 markers. That does not mean that they are going to come up again, okay? However, it could also mean that they will come up again, because it is completely unpredictable. They may test us on comparison twice. It's highly unlikely, and I would put my money on there not being another comparison and a how question, but you can never take these things for granted. So don't forget everything that you've learned about comparison questions. Don't forget everything you've learned about how questions. They could definitely come up again. And finally, they will expect you to answer both questions. This will seem incredibly obvious to a lot of you, but I want everyone to be aware that you need to answer both the talk and the article in Unit 3. Don't just answer one. I know a few years ago during COVID, they released some papers which were trimmed down and had only one writing piece that you had to write for Unit 3. Please understand you must answer both. Don't stop 20 minutes towards the end of your exam and think that you finished the writing section when you've only written a talk. You must write both. I cannot stress that enough. Things we don't know. If all the question types will appear, the focus of the paper, and if they will repeat question types already used. As I said, comparison questions, they've used it. How question, they've used it. They could still do it again. Don't take anything for granted. They are incredibly unpredictable with their papers. So what I thought I'd do, which would be quite useful, is do a synthesis recap. If I had to guess, and I was a betting man, I would put my money on there being a synthesis question on the next paper, just because they tend to try and test you on both of these, comparisons and synthesis, one on each paper. If we've had the comparison, logic tells me that we're going to have a synthesis. However, I wouldn't apply too much logic to WJEC exam boards, because you just don't really know what they're going to throw at you. So in terms of synthesis, you are not comparing two texts. And the way I think about it and the way I structure a synthesis response is each paragraph, so each text requires its own mini paragraph, okay? And in each of those, you should have a summative statement, 4 to 5 points from each text. Notice I put the /5 in there because I think it looked prettier being linked to S4C, and C, concluding overview. So if we look at this question here, using information from text A and text B, synthesize the problems faced by children when a country is at war. So again, this could come up as Unit 3 as well as Unit 2. It could be with 5 as well as 10. I don't think we've ever had a 5-mark synthesis question, so I bet it would be either an 8 or a 10 mark. But again, we've had the Unit 2 paper, so this is probably going to come up on Unit 3. Now, if we broke down what I was saying earlier, you need a summative statement, so a summing up of what the text is about. Now, I've seen students do this in one of two ways, either a summary at the start of the paragraph per text, or an overall summary of both texts. Now, the reason I say 4/5 points and not straight up 5 points if it's a 10 marker is because the summative statement and the concluding overview can often pick you up that extra mark depending on what you say in there. Okay, so you can sort of get away with having 4 points and still making your overall grade the highest it can possibly be by getting 10 out of 10, for example. However, if you want to be safe, make sure you get 5 points from both texts to make sure that you are covering all of your bases. So I always remember S4C, summative, 4 to 5 points, 4 to 5 points, concluding overview. Now, the concluding overview is just a summing up of that text. Sometimes this won't be relevant or won't be necessary. You may think that you've summed everything up in your 4 to 5 points from text A and text B. If you've done that, don't hesitate to move on. It's very unlikely that you'll pick marks up in the concluding overview. It's far more likely that you will pick up marks in the summative statement. So just keep that in mind. So if I was to show it to you as well as part of a 3 text, this is roughly what I would do for a 3 text. They have done 3 text comparisons and synthesis in the past. They could definitely throw a 3 text at you. And if they do, 3 points from each. You may want an extra point in 1 or 2 of them to just make sure that you hit all of those points, because they could argue that you only got 9 out of 10. Still an A star, but it's important to make sure that we get all the marks that we can. Notice how, again, it's got that summative statement, it's got that concluding overview. Make sure that you're getting those points in. So if I had to show you the start of one, my summative statement here: the problems faced by children during the times of warfare are established in text A and text B as they identify how a child's life can change when there is conflict. Nice overview of both texts. I've not compared them. I've just said roughly what they're about. Again, that could pick me up a mark in the exam. Next, this is the start of my 4 points. Text A begins by commenting on the emotional neglect that can be faced by children by describing emotional care as lacking. Notice how I'm not really delving into the article. This is not a how question. You don't have to ram as many techniques in there as possible and try and analyze what the writer is saying and how they're saying it. In a synthesis, your goal is to just create a new text from 2 texts or more. That means you're not giving me a huge amount of sort of analysis of the text. It's more like you are doing a summary with some quotes in there. Okay. So it says there, text A begins by commenting on the emotional neglect that can be faced by children by describing emotional care as lacking. I've not gone into a huge amount of detail, but I've got myself 1 point there. And I've got the ellipsis here to indicate how you should carry on from that. Now, this is something that I would use with my classes to demonstrate just how to lay it out. But essentially, you need to do a paragraph like this with obviously 4 to 5 points rather than just the one that I've got there, in order to sum up your model. Okay. Make sure you do that for each text. Don't just do one text. Don't overdo one text and underdo a different text. Make sure they're quite balanced. And that is pretty much how you answer a synthesis question. So always remember S4C, summative statement, 4-4, concluding interview. Okay, overview, sorry. Right, in terms of writing them, this will be very familiar to those of you who watched my last video, but it is a slightly different mark scheme, okay, in terms of what it's asking for in comparison to the last one you did. The last one was out of 20 for communicating and organizing, and out of 15 for writing accurately. These are both worth 9 out of 10 essentially, and I've shown you the major 2 bandings here, band 4 and band 5, to show you the differences, but also to show you that you can achieve that no matter your ability level. You just have to follow what the rubric says. And what does it say? The same thing as I said yesterday: mature and perceptive writing, sustained and effective writing with techniques that engage the reader's interest. It's all about engagement. Appropriate register to purpose and audience. That means you're speaking in a correct way that your audience will be able to understand it, or they will be able to relate to it. Ideas are convincingly developed, and as you can see, this is pretty much an identical mark scheme to the one you did for Unit 2. The only difference is that they are both at equal weighting. That means your writing accurately is even more important than it was in the last paper. Okay? Make sure that you are writing as accurately as possible and you're being as adventurous with your vocabulary. So, the 2 types that they're asking you to talk about, what they want. I've just sort of broken them down here to say the differences between the 2 of them. Articles, you'll want to use a bold heading and several subheadings to divide your ideas. An article should be a relatively formal piece because it needs to look professional. Now, that comes with a caveat. The language should match the audience. Don't throw in any slang. Don't start slipping in terms of your grammatical structure. But often in the exam, they will ask you to write for a teenage audience or an audience of your own year group. So that means you need to gear the article to be appealing to somebody your age. All right. Don't be too formal. Don't say, would you want your kids growing up in a world without proper education? They can't relate to children at this present time. Okay. You need to be able to relate it to something that is relevant to them. All right. So please adapt your language to the audience. And as it says in the mark scheme, appropriate register is confidently adapted to purpose audience. To get into those top boundaries, you need to be doing that. Also, with an article, you must keep a coherent structure while aiming to be creative and inventive with your content. What I mean by that is it still needs to stay in some kind of order. You don't want to be jumping all over the place, because what will end up happening is that you will sort of drop away and ramble on about something that is completely unnecessary because you're sort of panicking that you want to write as much as you can. And in reality, it'll take away from the article because it'll show that you haven't really thought about it. That is why planning is so essential for something like an article. On these Unit 3 writing pieces, you should be aiming for 1.5 to 2 pages per one. Obviously, write as much as you possibly can, and some of you will write a heck of a lot more than 1.5 to 2 pages, but just keep in mind that that is roughly what they're asking for in terms of their word limit. On talk, okay, talk is different. Please don't use bold headings and subheadings on a talk. It's a completely different structure because a talk is meant to be spoken. Okay, so obviously you won't be standing up in the exam and actually speaking this to your invigilators, as funny as that would be. You want to be using things like motivational language and constant audience engagement rather than structuring it with headings and subheadings, because you might as well just be writing another article. In the same way, audience engagement is sort of a grey area in an article. You obviously want the audience to engage with you, but it's very rare that you will read an article and they will ask you questions. They may ask rhetorical questions, but in a talk, you would probably be asking those questions to the audience. As I said, for 2 there, subheadings would look at a place. Instead, use a focus statement for each paragraph to indicate a structure. So what that means is at the start of each of your paragraphs for a talk, I would make sure that you use almost like a verbal subheading. So you give a sentence alluding to what you're about to talk about in that speech. What that doesn't mean is you start off by going, next, I will talk to you about, because it's incredibly boring and it won't actually engage your audience. And again, that's on the mark scheme, keeping your audience engaged. So instead, each paragraph should start with something that is a hook. It keeps you engaged and keeps you wanting to read on, or in this case, listen on, because it's a speech. And again, 3, stay focused and don't ramble off topic. What I thought would be quite useful as well, as I've done with my classes, I've talked about techniques to use when you're writing a piece like this. These kind of transactional tasks, which are what articles and talks are, you want to try and cram in your techniques where you can, but only where it's appropriate and you're not shoehorning them in. Now, everyone knows the traditional forest rap. I cannot stand the idea of forest rap. I don't like these kind of gimmicky things that that people make you do, like, as I said, forest rap. I just think it's a bit ridiculous. Instead, just learn the techniques and think about it logically. What techniques would be really useful? So if I showed you some of the ones you would have learned going through school, declarative statements, so stating an opinion as if it's a fact. I don't follow football at all. I've just got an example there. United are the greatest team in England. I'm going to have very many disagreements with people over that, I suppose, but I just don't care. Facts and statistics as well, things that are true. Pronouns, words such as I, us, we, you, incredibly important for speeches because you're trying to involve the audience. We need to stand up and do something. You know, pronouns are super important. Modal verbs, may, must, will. Okay, they may break us down, but we will fight back. They're incredibly important to use in speeches. Can use them in articles as well, but again, it's quite useful for any transactional writing task. Rule of 3 or tripling, so listing of 3 things. Now, this is important because a lot of people seem to overlap tripling with alliteration, and that you think that you have to alliterate in order to use tripling. You don't at all. Tripling can be just a rule of 3. So this room, this school, and in this community, that would be tripling. Okay, you can use it in that way instead of just being alliterative. Constantly trying to ram alliteration in there just because you think it needs to go in with tripling is incorrect, really, and you don't need to force it in all the time. Contrasts and opposites as well, so using opposing ideas. So where there is dark, we will bring light, and that's very fanciful, but it's a useful thing to do, is talking about contrasts. They may try to break us down, but we will fight back, as I used earlier on for my modal verb example. Emotive language, words or phrases which create a deliberate emotion. So if you say something like the desperate situation is better than saying the situation we are in. Or, you know, if you said, if there are puppies on the side of the road, you might say, these poor disheveled puppies have been neglected on the side of this road, constantly splashed by the water as the cars drive past. You're creating some kind of emotion in the audience. Rhetorical questions as well. You know all about rhetorical questions. You've done them since primary school. Techniques further. Use of opposite views. So very similar to contrasts, but this is all about using a counter argument and then using it to argue against it. I'd argue this is far more relevant for exposition, which you would have just done. But you can use it. Depending on what the article and the speech is about, you could use the opposite of you and then argue against it. Pathos, so creating sadness. As I said earlier about emotive language, pathos is just a specific form of it. So being able to generate sadness in your audience. Simple sentences, so a short sentence with a main clause to create impact. So we must act now. Nice sort of simple sentence to keep people thinking. Imagery, so similes, metaphors, personifications, and any other imageries that you may be able to think of, like olfactory, gustatory, auditory, and so on and so forth. Again, it's more of a creative thing to use those kinds of imageries, but you could find a way to squeeze them in if needed. Using light-outs can be quite useful. So understatements, like it hurt a little when my arm fell off. It can be a good way of engaging the audience in, say, a speech or in an article. So like you might say in an article, if the article was on, teens overusing social media, you might say, I don't spend very much time on my phone, only 16 hours a day. You can create those comic elements which may engage your audience. Hyperbole is overstatement. You know hyperbole, you probably didn't know light-outs though. So hyperbole, I nearly died when I stubbed my toe. Again, it's a useful kind of phrase to use. Overstatement is always engaging. Topic sentences, which is something I talked about earlier, it sets out what your paragraph will do. This isn't the only reason we must change. The use of a mobile device, ... That is a good way of engaging the audience in your next statement, rather than saying, next I will be talking to you about, because it's very basic. Instead, use a topic sentence, get them on board in that way. And finally, probably the most important thing when it comes to writing speeches is an anecdote. They are very powerful. Being able to give a story, even if it's made up from your life or something that relates to your story, shows that you have real world experience, and it may engage the audience even further. So hopefully with all of those things I've talked about, that might help you on your Unit 3 paper. I'm putting this up a little bit early because I know we're about a week away from the paper. If anyone would like me to cover anything specific, or if you think I really need a recap on some of the other reading questions like summary, explain, and so on, I'm happy to do those videos. Just please get in touch, okay? And I will always respond if anyone's got any further questions. So as I said, keep those things in mind, and these are the things we know for Unit 3. Please take a screenshot of them. Please pause the video, have a look at them. They're giving you a bit of a winner here by allowing you to talk about a talk in an article. They know you're going to talk about them because that's what they're putting on the paper. Just impress them. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you next time.